Welcome to the next lecture on artificial intelligence. Earlier we have looked at what in machine learning, the paradigm of machine learning, and we have discussed different learning problems, and specifically we have talked about what is concept learning, and we mentioned that different algorithms can be used for the concept learning task or for classification task. In the last two classes we discussed a particular type of learning algorithms, which is induction using decision trees. We looked at algorithms to learn decision trees from data. Today we are going to look at another model using which we can do concept learning. The model that we will talk about is actually a general model, and different variations of it can be used for many other tasks. What we are talking about is the connectionist paradigm, which is used more commonly known as neural networks. We will first briefly discuss what a neural network is, and then we will see how different types or some types of neural networks can be used for the concept learning task. The instructional objectives of today's lecture are as follows. The student will be introduced to the neural network framework. They will learn about a linear threshold unit or a perceptron, which is a very simple model of a neural network. The student will understand the type of functions that can be represented using a perceptron. The student will learn how a perceptron can be trained given some data to fit the training data, and then they will learn how gradient descent can be applied in order to learn a perceptron or to learn a simple linear unit. They will see that the gradient descent learning minimizes the sum of the squared error for a linear unit, and we will also introduce the students to a sigmoid unit, which we will use as a basis for multi-layered neural network. So, neural networks are actually a different paradigm for computing, just like the conventional computers that you have studied is based on the von Neumann framework of computing. The neural networks is based on a slightly different idea of computing. This paradigm has been inspired biologically by trying to emulate the parallel architecture of human and animal brains. So, a neural network system comprises of many units which work in parallel. These units are individually simple units, but together they can be wired to perform more complex tasks. So, the main highlights of this framework are that there are several or many simple processing elements. There is a high degree of interconnection between these processing units, and there are simple messages which are being transferred through these interconnections, and the interaction between these different elements is adaptive. This is the essence of the neural network paradigm. Before we look into the details of the neural network, let us take a very brief look at the history of neural computing. In 1943, McCulloch and Pitts did some work which is usually recognized to be the first work on neural networks. In 1949, the first learning rule for neural network was devised. In 1969, Minsky and Papert published a paper which highlighted the computational limitations or representational limitations of a perceptron unit. This led to a virtual decline in the research work in artificial neural networks. Fortunately, the 1980s saw a re-emergence of interest in artificial neural network, and many researchers came up with more complex architectures in the form of multi-layered networks that overcome the limitation of the perceptrons. And today, neural networks, research in the area of neural networks is quite active, and they are being used in a variety of application areas. Now, let us look at very briefly at a difference in the architecture of conventional computing and neural computers. Conventional computers are known for the fast computations or fast arithmetic, the number crunching that they can do, and they are very good for delivering precise algorithmic solutions. Precise algorithmic solutions can be programmed in a conventional computing model. On the other hand, the connectionist paradigm is very good for handling noisy data, for taking into account the massive amount of parallelism between different processors. Such computations are fault tolerant and they are adaptive. Now, what is as I mentioned, the neural network, the connectionist framework has been biologically inspired by the structure of animal or human brains. We all know that humans and animals are extremely intelligent and can do certain tasks remarkably well, and so far our sophisticated computers have not been able to come up to the level of humans or even animals in performing certain routine tasks. So, we have earlier in the beginning lectures, we have looked at some such tasks, for example, computer vision, image recognition, speech, language understanding, and so on. So, many scientists, cognitive scientists, psychologists and other people have extensively studied the brain in humans and some other animals, but it is a really very complex, like many other biological structures and functions, it is a very complex unit, and it is very difficult to understand the brain completely. And actually, the brain is composed of a number of units known as neurons. These neurons are also individually very complex units, and together they constitute the brain. So, a neuron, the basic structure of a neuron or a nerve cell, which occurs in the brain and as well as in other parts of the body, is described in this diagram. So, the neuron has a nucleus and a cell body and the nucleus, and there is a tail called the axon. There are dendrites, which are units which come out from the cell body, and at the end of the dendrites there is a synapse through which pulses communication takes place between different neurons. Now, some salient features of the human brain is as follows. There are about 10 to the power 10 neurons. Each neuron has several thousand connections. Neuron switching times are of the order of 10 to the power minus 3 second, that is 1 microsecond. A neuron can perform hundreds of operations per second. Also, neurons die off frequently and some of them are never replaced. So, these are the salient features of the human brain, and we all know the sort of tasks that human brains can perform. For example, we are very good at recognizing faces, and typically recognizing faces takes us an average of 0.1 seconds. Now, let us try to contrast this with the structure of what we have been able to achieve in a modern day computer, and we will notice that even though the number of gates or transistors in a modern day computer is large, it is less than what we find in a human brain. However, the switching time of the devices that make up a computer are very fast, and our processing elements can work faster than the processing units in the brain. So, just to look at the salient features, the brain is good for pattern recognition, for association, for like faces with the names, complexity, and they can tolerate noise to a large extent. A modern day computer or a machine, on the other hand, is good for calculation, for precise answers, and for being able to apply logic or the rational process. The von Neumann architecture used in conventional computing usually comprises of a single processing unit which can perform tens of millions of operations per second, and the arithmetic precision is very high. On the other hand, the human brain consists of many slow, unreliable processors that act in parallel. And we know that the brain is still capable of doing many complex tasks. The idea between the connectionist paradigm is to try to emulate this structure of the brain and to devise a computing paradigm inspired by this, which can perform complex tasks using this sort of framework. Now, what we will do is, as we mentioned, that typically a neural network comprises of many simple processing units. So, we will first study a single processing unit, simple processing unit, which we call the perceptron, and we will discuss what a perceptron can represent and how a perceptron can be learned. So, the unit that we are describing now is called a perceptron or a linear threshold unit. So, in a linear threshold unit, the unit can take a number of inputs, x1, x2 up to xn are the different inputs to this unit. These inputs are connected to this LTU via some arcs, and there are weights associated with each of these arcs. For example, this arc has a weight of W1, this arc has a weight of W2, and this arc has a weight of Wn. Now, what this unit here does is it sums, it finds out the weighted sum of these inputs, that is W1 x1 plus W2 x2 up to Wn xn, and this input performs the function of thresholding. So, this unit finds a weighted sum of the inputs and then it applies the threshold. If this sum is greater than a threshold, then the output of the perceptron is 1, otherwise the output of the perceptron is minus 1. So, this summation unit is followed by a thresholding unit. In this thresholding unit, the threshold is applied. So, which this two processes can be looked upon as this threshold can be written as, we can have a special input x0 which is equal to 1, and associated with it we can have a weight W0 which we have to adjust to get the threshold. So, this entire unit really computes this function sigma wi xi for I varying from 0 to n, and if this summation is greater than 0, then the output is 1, otherwise the output is minus 1. So, this is a simple linear threshold unit. So, this part is a linear part which computes the sum, and this part applies a step function, a nonlinear step function on this sum, and the output from this unit is either plus 1 or minus 1. So, typically in a neural network we have inputs. These inputs, so we can have more than one input. So, these inputs are fed to the network through what is called the input layer, and then each of these things are the output. The outputs are known as the output layer. To compute this output, these inputs are fed to the outputs through these connections. You see, in this case there are 6 inputs. All the 6 inputs are fed to each output unit, and this output unit provides an answer. Let us say y1. This is input x1, this is x2, this is x3, this is x4, this is x5 and x6. And corresponding to these 6 inputs, there are these 6 arcs which feed into the output unit, and the output of this unit is y1. There are weights on these arcs, w1, w2, w3 and so on. Now, these weights can be adjusted to learn a given function. So, in a perceptron, in a network of perceptrons, the system works as follows. The weights on the arcs are changed to so what happens is that we want to adjust the weights on the perceptron so that the function that we want to represent can be correctly represented. As in other concept learning tasks, we start with the training data, and then we find whether the function that we wish to compute at this output is being indeed computed at these output units. So, we try to find whether the correct function is being computed. If the correct function is not being computed, we will change the weights so that the correct function can be computed. So, what we normally do in training a neural network is we start with an initial arbitrary value of the weights, and we inspect the data that we have got. If the data that we have got agrees perfectly with the current structure of the perceptron, then we are very happy. If it does not, then we change the values of the weights so that it better represents the data. So, this process is called perceptron learning or training the neural network. Now, suppose we are given some data or given one example data, and according to that data there are some inputs. So, the inputs are, let us say, x1, x2, xn, and corresponding to this input, the output, the target output is t. So, if our network correctly represents the function, then the network for the inputs x1, x2, xn should give an output of t. But if our network does not exactly represent the function, it will give a different output, let us say O. So, if t and O are identical, then we do not change the weights. but if T and O are different, then we adjust the weights of the network so that O is closer to T. So, the general weight training rule is like this for a simple perceptron. After processing some training examples, each weight on arc is adjusted as follows. Wi new is old Wi plus delta Wi. So, to each weight we apply an incremental change of delta Wi. Now, what is delta Wi? So, we take delta Wi to be equal to eta times T minus O into xi. So, T minus O is the difference between the target and the achieved output. If T equal to O, then we do not change the weight, delta Wi is equal to 0. But if they are not same, then we change delta Wi proportional to T minus O times the weight of the input, and along with it we use this parameter eta, which is called the learning rate. If this learning rate is high, we make a bigger change. If eta is small, we make a smaller change. Now, let us see, suppose the target is 1. So, for this input the output should have been 1, but O is 0. Okay. In that case, what we are doing is that if T is 1 and O is 0, T minus O is positive, and we are increasing delta Wi. If we increase delta Wi, what will happen? Wi will increase. If Wi increases, since our unit does a summation of sigma Wi xi, so if Wi is increased, if xi is positive, then the final output will increase. The target is 1, O was 0. So, if the value of the output increases, it will go towards 1 if xi is positive. If xi is negative, then delta Wi will be negative, and then it will go towards the negative direction. So, this training rule, what it tries to do is it tries to push O towards the T, towards the target value. So to recapitulate, the training rule is as follows: Wi is changed by eta T minus O into xi, where T is the target value, O is the perceptron output that we have obtained, and eta is a small constant which is known as the learning rate. Now, what does this training do? If T is equal to O, then do nothing. If T is not equal to O, then the weights Wi are changed such that the output of the perceptrons for the new weights is closer to T. This algorithm converges to the correct classification under the following conditions. If the training data is linearly separable and if the value of eta is sufficiently small. This condition we will explain. So, the basic idea is that some functions can be represented by a perceptron, and we will see that only linearly separable functions can be represented by a perceptron. If the function is not representable by the perceptron, then this algorithm may not give you the correct result after training. But if the function can be represented, that is if it is linearly separable, then if we use the learning, if the learning rate that we use is sufficiently small, then this process converges. And if we start with a perceptron with an initial arbitrary value of the weights, by applying that training rule over the data that we have seen, we will be able to get finally a wet vector which is able to represent the correct function. So, the learning algorithm, the basic learning algorithm is as follows. The learning algorithm works in several phases or several epochs. in each epoch, the entire training set is presented to the neural network. Based on the entire training set, the error is computed, and based on the error, the weights are updated. And the error is the amount by which what is output by the network differs from the target. So, suppose we have this perceptron structure where we have x and y are the two inputs, and this is the output, and the target is 0.0. Now, we initialize the weights as random values. Suppose w is equal to 0.3, this w0, w1 is 0.5 and w2 is minus 0.4. Now, suppose the function that we are trying to learn is the AND function, for which the truth table is given here. If a is 0 and b is 0, then the output is 0. If a is 0 and b is 1, output is 0, and only if a is 1 and b is 1, then the output is 1. In all other cases, it is 0. Now, given this network, we have to see what is the error of the network for this with respect to this table. For example, if the input, if I1 is if a is 0 and b is 0, then we can try to find out what would be the output. So, for a is 0, for b is 0, what we get is these links do not contribute anything, only this link contributes. So, we get the output as minus 0.3, and the output should have been 0. For a is 0, b is 1, we get an output of minus 0.7, and the output should have been 0. For a is 1, b is 0, what we get is an output of 0.2, output should have been 1. For a is 1, b is 1, the output is minus 0.2, the output should have been 0. So, this is the current error that we have on this perceptron, and what we will try to do is adjust the weights using the weight training rule that we saw, delta wi is eta t minus o xi, is to adjust the weights. Now, in order to analyze this training rule theoretically, what we will look at is a unit which is slightly different from the thresholding unit that we have looked at. So, what we can do is we will look at a simple linear unit, that is, which performs the summation, but does not perform the thresholding. Okay. So, we use a simple linear unit, and we want to find out the weight vector for which the linear unit is optimum. That is, you see, the linear unit also will give a value, right, and without the thresholding forces the value to be either minus 1 or plus 1. So, what we will do instead is that we will take a linear unit and we will require it to exactly be 0 under the 0 conditions, 1 under the 1 conditions, which we can use. Now, for the linear unit, the output is given by w0 plus w1 x1 up to wn xn, and our task is to learn the value of the weights so that the error is minimized. Now, the definition of weight that we will consider is the squared error, which is a very popular measure of error. So, the error is with respect to the current value of the weight vector. The weight values are the ones that we are trying to adjust. For a given value of the weights, we will have a given value of the error. As we change the weights, the error function will change. So, error is a function of the weights, and we use the following definition of error. EW is half of sum over all training examples TD minus OD whole square. So, TD is the dth is the particular training for particular training example, it is the target value, and OD is the output for that input by our network. So, TD minus OD is 0 means the network agrees with the example. TD minus OD, if it is not 0, then it means it does not agree. So, summation of these TD minus OD whole square times half is the error function that we will use. It is a very commonly used error function. Now, what we will do is inspired by gradient ascent. So, you are aware that if we have a curve, suppose we have a curve and this curve is a function of w. If we take a point on the curve and if we find the slope of that point, the slope gives the direction in which the curve is moving. Now, if we move towards the direction of the slope a little bit, we will be going towards the top of the curve. And you know that at the extremum points, the slope is 0. So, if the slope df dw is greater than 0, that means if we follow the curve, we will move towards the peak of the curve. If df dw is equal to 0, we have reached the extremum position of the curve. Now, our objective is we are given an error function on the weights and we have to adjust the weight values in order to go to a region where the error is minimum. So, instead of doing gradient ascent, we will try to do gradient descent on the error curve, and our objective will be to start with a point and then move in the negative direction to the slope until we reach a point where the slope is equal to 0, that is we reach the minimum of the error function. Now, the error surface, the error depends on the weight vector as I have mentioned. Now, suppose we have a very simple system or simple learning problem where there are only two weights W0 and W1. Now, the error function can be given as half sigma Tk minus Ok whole square, and if we have a OK as a linear unit, then we have a quadratic error function, and this quadratic error function has the shape of a parabola. And you know the characteristic of a parabola is that it has a unique minima. Now, our objective is, you see, when we start, we have a particular set of weight values. Suppose this is our current weight value. We want to find that combination of weights for which the error is minimum. So, we want to reach this combination of weight values, and we have started from this place in the error surface. So, what we will do is we will compute the gradient at this point of the error surface, and we will take a small step in the negative direction of the gradient so that we can descend the error surface, and we will go on descending the error surface until we reach closer to the global minimum, and finally we might be able to reach the global minimum, because in this case for this surface, because it is a parabolic surface, there is only one minima which we can reach. So, the error function, error on the weights, is given by half sum over Tk minus Ok whole square, and the gradient of this error function, you see, we can find the partial derivative of this error function with respect to each weight value. So, grad EW can be written as del E del W0, del E del W1, del E del Wn. So, we have the error slope along every dimension, which gives us the gradient vector. Now, our training rule will be to change each weight towards the negative direction of the gradient vector, so that we can descend the error surface, that is delta, the w is the weight vector. So, delta w is equal to minus eta grad E w. So, grad E w is the this quantity, which is the partial derivative of the error vector. So, each individual wi is changed as follows: delta wi equal to minus eta del E del wi, that is partial derivative of E with respect to wi. So, we have to find out what is delta wi for the linear unit that we are considering. Now, so in gradient descent, we are trying to train the wi's to minimize the squared error, which is given by half sigma over all training examples TD minus OD whole square. And as we saw in the last slide, grad EW is a vector of the partial derivatives of the with respect to the weights, and delta wi is minus eta del E del wi. Now, let us try to compute del E del wi for the error function that we have chosen. Now, what is E? E is nothing but half sigma TD minus OD whole square. Now, what is OD? OD is nothing but sigma wi xi. So, we have to find the partial derivative with respect to wi from this function half sigma TD minus sigma wi xi whole square. Now, you note that the only portion of this function that depends on wi is this portion, the TD minus sigma wi xi whole square. When we are taking a particular wi only corresponding to this wi, this term is the only important term. So, this derivative can be written as 2 times TD minus OD into minus xi. So, here the derivative is minus xi, change of variables, we have 2 times this function TD minus sigma wi xi whole square, which is 2 times TD minus OD into minus xi into half, which gives us eta sigma over d TD minus OD into minus xi negative of this. So, to sum it up, we have the following algorithm for performing gradient descent on a linear unit, given a set of training examples capital D and where we have n inputs. So, the algorithm proceeds as follows: we initialize each wi to a small random value. Then we perform the following loop. Until the termination condition is met, we do the following. Initially, we put delta wi is 0, that is, we reset the value of delta wi. Then we pick up each training example from capital D. So, each training example comprises of the inputs x1, x2, xn and the target value t. For each of these training examples, what we do is we give this input to the linear unit and compute the output O. Output O is simply sigma wi xi. Now, for each linear unit, what we do is for each linear weight, what we do is we modify delta wi as delta wi is as eta times t minus O times xi, and then we say wi is wi plus delta wi. This is following the method that we found out, that delta Wi should be eta into t minus O times xi. Now, we continue doing this until termination. In the termination condition, the error falls under a, we terminate when the error falls under a given threshold. Okay, just a minute, I think I made a mistake. So, what we are doing is, we are looking at all the training examples. Now, for each training example, what we are going to do is, we are going to find out the error with respect to that training example, and we do it for all the training examples. So, we basically are finding the sum of this term over all the training example. That is why we have to do delta Wi is previous delta Wi plus eta times t minus O times xi, and before we started this loop we had put delta Wi as 0. So, what we are doing is basically we are finding out the sigma over all training examples eta t minus O xi. So, we are doing a version of gradient descent which is called the batch gradient descent algorithm, where we have a particular, we start with a particular weight vector, we process all the training examples, we find the cumulative error, and accordingly we change the weights, and again we continue this process, we stop when the error is acceptable. Now, this version of gradient descent, this algorithm is called incremental stochastic gradient descent. This version is called the batch mode gradient descent, where the weight takes care of the error over all the training examples. However, this is expensive to apply because after processing all the training examples once, we are able to adjust the weight values once, and therefore, this process can take a very long time. So, what people often use instead is an incremental version of the gradient descent algorithm, where for each example that is processed, the weight vector is changed. And this incremental gradient descent is expected to be much faster than the batch mode gradient descent. In incremental gradient descent, what we do is, we modify the weight vector by processing a single training example. So, we look at a single training example, with respect to it we modify the weights, then we look at one more training example, then we modify the weights and so on. So, this process is much faster because after every training example we modify the weights. So, the rate of change of weights is much faster. And the good news is that incremental gradient descent is an approximation to batch gradient descent, and if we keep the value of eta small, then the incremental gradient descent converges to some values which is very close to what you will get by using batch gradient descent, and this is something that we usually use in practice. Okay, so before we continue, now let us look at the type of functions that can be represented by a linear unit or by a linear threshold unit. So, what we really want to know is what is the decision boundary. You see, the perceptron will basically try to separate the positive examples from the negative examples, and in order to do that, we use the geometric concept of a decision boundary. So, the decision boundary separates the positive from the negative examples. For example, suppose we have these two features x1 and x2, and we have training examples of, we have examples which belong to two different classes. These belong to A, and these belong to B, and we want to separate the A's from the B's, and we can have this decision surface so that the A's are on one side of the decision surface, the B's are on the other side. Now, in this case you see that in this two-dimensional case we can draw a straight line separating the A's from the B's. Okay. in all cases we will not be able to get a straight line separating the a's and the b's, but in this case we can get, and we say that this function is linearly separable. What if we have more than two features, input features? In that case, if we have n input features and if we can have a n minus 1 dimensional hyperplane that separates the two classes, then also we will say that the function is linearly separable. Now, the perceptron learns a function of the form w1 x1 plus w2 x2 plus wn xn whatever. So, this is a linear function which defines a hyperplane. So, a perceptron can only successfully separate the classes between which there is a linear separator. So, this figure is an example of points which are linearly separable. You see the green points are separated from the yellow points by this line. Now, here we have another example where we have two positive points here and two negative points here, and you can see that we cannot find a plane or find a straight line which separates the positive points from the negative points. Such a straight line does not exist. So, we say that this training set is not linearly separable. This training set is linearly separable because there exists this line that separates the positive points from the negative points. Now, this is an example of an arbitrary function which is not linearly separable. Now, if you try to learn this function using a perceptron, you can find a straight line which no straight line will be able to perfectly separate the positive from the negative points, that is the pink points from the green points. So, you need a more complex decision surface to separate the positive from the negative points. Perhaps this decision surface separates most of the pink points from the green point, but there is something left over. So, you also need to incorporate this. So, you need more complex decision surfaces to separate for this problem. So, what we will be looking at in the subsequent classes are neural paradigms where we can deal with such complex functions. Now, when we have threshold units, we cannot do gradient descent because the thresholding is a discontinuous function. This function, the step function, is not differentiable, and we did the differentiation, the derivative finding, in order to find the slope. So, instead of dealing with threshold units, we can look at linear units. But if we use linear units can only, a single linear unit can only give us linear decision surfaces, not more complex decision surfaces. Now, what we can do is we can think of having multi-layer neural networks, so that we can cascade these different layers and we can build more complex networks. But if we make more complex networks out of linear units, you can easily see that the result is again another linear network. So, a linear function is not able to represent all types of functions. So, what we want to do is we want to be able to represent more complex functions, and in order to do this we will be using multi-layer neural networks, but we cannot use linear units because that will not give us the power, and we do not want to use thresholding units. Using thresholding units in multiple layers, we will see that we can represent more complex functions, but thresholding units are difficult to learn because we cannot use the trick of gradient descent. So, what we will do is we will try to look at other types of functions which are non-linear functions, but which are differentiable and using which we can represent more complex functions. So, that is what we will be looking at in the next lectures. Okay. Now, this is an example. Before we will just very briefly introduce multi-layer neural networks and the type of new types of units in today's class. In a multi-layer neural network, this is an example. This is the input layer. This is the input and this is the output. Between the input and the output, we put other units. These units correspond to the hidden units. In a layered neural network, we will put these units in layers such that the output from one layer feeds us the input of the next layer. So, this is an example of a layered network where the input goes through several layers and then goes to the output. Now, we will call these intermediate layers as the hidden layers because they are not part of what is the output. Now, we will see that a layered network is able to represent the XOR function, which you cannot represent by a perceptron. So, if you just think of the XOR function, suppose you have two inputs x1 and x2, the XOR function has the following characteristic. So, if x1 is 1 or x2 is 0, then it is plus. If x2 is 0 and x1 is 1, then also it is plus. If both are 1, it is minus, and if both are 0, then also it is minus, and there is no line separating the pluses from the minuses. The XOR function can be represented by a two-layered network as follows. We can, you see, the OR and the AND functions can be represented by a simple perceptron, and I leave you to use an exercise to find out neural networks that can represent the AND and OR function. So, we can have this layer can find the OR of x1 and x2, this can find the AND of x1 and x2, and this can compute the XOR function. Okay. So, the XOR function can be computed by a two-layer network using 3 computing units. Now, when we have what we will just introduce today is that, as we said, that thresholding units are not amenable to differentiation, linear units do not give us the power, and we are going to look at nonlinear functions which are differentiable. And the sort of function that we will look at are the sigmoid function. The sigmoid function has a shape as follows. So, sigmoid function is a S-shaped function which is somewhat close to a thresholding function, and it gives us a value between 0 and 1, and we will be using a network of sigmoidal units as our computing units. So, in a sigmoid function we have these inputs, then there is first a summation of the inputs, and then we apply the sigmoid function. The sigmoid function of x is nothing but 1 by 1 plus e to the power minus x. So, the output of this summation unit is net, and the sigmoid function we find y equal to sigma of net, that is y equal to 1 divided by 1 plus e to the power minus net. This is also represented here as follows. We have this summation unit which is similar to what we have in linear threshold units, and then we apply the sigmoid function. So, output is sigma of net, the net is sigma wixi, and therefore, output is 1 by 1 plus e to the power minus sigma wixi. Now, the sigmoid function, as we said, is differentiable. It has a similarity, the shape is similar to the thresholding function little bit, and also the sigmoid functions are very easy to manipulate, because you see d sigma x dx gives us, so if you do the math the differentiation, you will see d sigma x dx is nothing but sigma x into 1 minus sigma x. So, this makes it very easy to compute the differentiation of the sigmoid function, and we will later next class we will see how multi-layered neural network using the sigmoid units can be learnt, and we will introduce the backprop. So, this is the actually the sigmoid function. This is the example of a sigmoid function. Now, so the sigmoid function is y equal to 1 by 1 plus e to the power minus x. Now, if we add another factor here k, then if we vary, so this function corresponds to k equal to 1, but if we vary the value of k, we will get other functions which are steeper than this sigmoid function. So, for k equal to 1, we get a function whose shape is this pink curve, but for other values of for k equal to 0.1, we get this curve. So, for different values of k, we can find different shapes of the sigmoid curve. And in the next class, we will see how to apply this to learn the sigmoid routines. So, we will stop now. Before stopping, we will like to very quickly discuss some of the questions that we have looked at in the earlier classes. In lecture 35, we have asked you to represent these functions using a decision tree. So, I think these things are very easy to represent using a decision tree. So, suppose for example, not A and B or C and not D. So, to represent it by decision tree, what you can do is we can initially let us say test on B. If B is true, then we test on A. If A is false, then the answer is positive, otherwise the answer is negative. If B is false, then we test on C. If C is true, then we test on D. If D is false, it is positive, and so on. So, we can build the decision tree corresponding to this function or this function. Actually, I just leave it to you as an exercise. What I will ask you to do is take the same functions and try to represent them using a neural network, initially using a perceptron, and if that fails, by using a more complex network of 2 layers. About the parity function on A, B, C and D, the decision tree will not be very small. It will be actually a full decision tree of 4 levels, where you have to list out all the paths involving A, B, C, D. So, you start with any of them, the attributes, let us say A, at the next level you take B, then C, then D, you draw the full decision tree and you find out the leaves which will be positive and the leaves which will be negative. So, this decision tree is going to be quite large. About the about the questions on lecture 36, the first question was, given a training set, how will you decide when to stop growing the tree? So, I think we have discussed most of these questions in the lecture. So, I will not because there is not much time today, we will not discuss it any further. Thank you.